начнем, я попрошу всех, пожалуйста, встать. Мы вдвоем тропаль новомученикам. Please stand for the prayer. Greetings, everyone. Цель нашей встречи сегодня, чтобы вспомнить подвиг святых новомучеников российских, их значение 100 лет спустя, и какое значение они имеют нам всем сегодня и будущее поколение. Our meeting tonight is to discuss the importance of the holy new Russian martyrs and what significance they play in the role of the future generation and the youth. Мы начинаем сегодня с докладом. We will start with our lecture by Professor Надежды Киценко from the University of Albany SUNY History Department with expertise in Orthodox Christianity and Russian Orthodoxy with degrees from Harvard and Columbia. After her speech, we will open the floor to a panel discussion, and the panel participants are Bishop Nicholas of Manhattan, Vice Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, Igumen Nicodim, Secretary to Bishop John Narofomensky, Representative of Patriarchal Cathedral of the Moscow Patriarchate, Nicholas Nicholson, who holds a bachelor's degree in Slavic Studies and Art History with the concentration in Imperial Russian Culture Traditions. Мы на двух языках сегодня вечером будем проводить наши дискуссии, и те, которые желают перевод на русский, с английского на русский, пожалуйста, если можете сесть сзади. Стефан, подними руку, пожалуйста. Стефан будет наш переводчик сегодня вечером, то, пожалуйста, можете рядом с Стефаном сесть. А так, приглашаю Надежду Киценко подойти, пожалуйста. Please.
Alrighty then. When Отец Andrei Summer first asked me to present this topic, I thought to myself, great, that's pretty straightforward. Then I started thinking about it and got worried precisely because it seemed so straightforward, which is to say, what new can one possibly have to say about the new martyrs? But actually, the key for our conversation today is in the name that Отец Andrei Summer gave this talk, which is to say the new martyrs and their meaning for our day, or as I subtitled it, and why they matter. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay. On the screen in front of you is an icon of the new martyrs and confessors of Russia. You may have seen this all the time. In the same way that anyone who has ever been to a vigil service can probably recite by heart that bit when the priest or the bishop goes, Mikhaila, Petra, Alexei, Iona, Filipa, Dimitri, Makari, Tikhona, Feodosia, Safa, Pitzirima, and Akenziana. And you think to yourself, maybe Okay, who actually are these people, and why should I care? The church mentions a great number of saints at every single service. At the end of every single service, the serving priest stands up in the front with his cross and goes through the saints of the day. When one looks at this icon, if one is in the United States or if one is in Russia, how one responds to it is perhaps slightly different. And this gets us to the broad problem of sanctity in our day and the broad problem of martyrdom in our day. Most of us sitting in this room probably do not expect to die as saints and probably do not expect to die as martyrs. And that's too bad, because the people that we're going to be talking about today also did not expect to end their lives as saints, and they also did not expect to end their lives as martyrs. The new martyrs of Russia are interesting to us precisely because they remind us that the rules of the game can change on you without your knowing it. You can start out life thinking, I'm going to be a professor, like me, or I'm going to be a lawyer and legal aid counsel, or I'm going to be a pharmacist or a nurse. And circumstances change, and precisely in that capacity, you find that you have become a martyr, you have become a saint, you have not become a man in black like the one sitting in front of you, you have not become an emperor or empress like the imperial family, you have stayed a nurse, you have stayed a pharmacist, you have stayed a professor, you have stayed a lawyer, and yet circumstances placed you in a position where you became a martyr, which should remind us that although none of us want this to happen, none of us expect this to happen, and yet one never knows. Next slide, please. Thank you. And it does make a difference that when I asked Otец Andrei if I should speak in English or in Russian, he said, well, it depends who you think the audience is going to be. And precisely, I would pitch this completely differently, or at least somewhat differently, if I thought the audience consisted of English speakers, as it does. Если же бы публика состоялась из тех, которые говорят по-русски, мой подход был бы немножко другой. Я объясню почему. Even if you are from a parish in the United States, like the St. Vladimir Memorial Church in Jackson, New Jersey, where my father was priest for many years. Next slide, please. Or if you go to Orthodox youth camps in the United States, it is all too easy when one looks at an icon like the new Martyrs and Confessors of Russia to think, well, okay, but that's not really my problem. We understand that what happened to the new martyrs is very, very bad. We understand that communism was very, very bad. Lucky for me that I live in the United States, which is not a communist country and which opposed communism. So it's easy for me to feel bad about the new martyrs of Russia because it wasn't my fault in any way, or so we think. It wasn't the fault of the system in which I am living, or so we think. Next slide, please. Is the situation different if one is in Russia? Next slide, please. Or for that matter, Belarus, or for that matter, in any of the successor states of the former Soviet Union. Does one's attitude change? Should one's attitude change if the events that occurred happened on the territory on which you are living, and if perhaps your ancestors were implicated in this in some way? When you try to make sense of the problem of the new martyrs, is it a different problem if you are an Orthodox Christian in the United States for whom ultimately the new martyrs of Russia, how different are they than martyrs of Serbia or martyrs in contemporary Syria? What does it actually mean to you as opposed to if you live in Russia or in any of the successor states of the Soviet Union? Next slide, please. The answer is actually yes, it does matter, because there is one example of martyrdom with which we are all tragically familiar, and that is the problem of martyrdom of people who live in the contemporary Middle East. Next slide, please. These girls waking up in the morning and going to school, like the first graders in Sandy Hook, next slide, please, did not expect that at the end of the day, they would end up as we see them now. In the Middle East today, martyrdom is something that can strike at any time in any place, not that differently. For example, if you're attending a country music concert in Las Vegas, one never knows when sudden violent death may happen. The difference is that in the Middle East today, and in the days of the new martyrs, it could also strike completely unexpected. Next slide, please. But one difference between martyrdom for us now, as opposed to the ISIS killers who try to and succeed in killing Christians in the Middle East, is that for us right now, martyrdom isn't something cool. It isn't a thing. It isn't something that people grow up trying aspirationally to be. Although I will say parenthetically that because my patron saint was a child who was martyred at the age of 9 along with her sisters and mother. So I actually tried saying to my mother at the age of 9, like, well, I really hope I'm martyred because then all of my sins will be clean and I know I'll go to heaven. And she goes, you're right, but that's a bad attitude. And the early church condemned it. And in fact, the early church did condemn people who actively went out of their way and sought martyrdom. Because in fact, in the early church, and here there's an image familiar to those of us who like the Hollywood biopics of the 1950s, martyrdom was something that was a public spectacle. And one of the differences between martyrdom in the early church and martyrdom as it happened to the new martyrs is that in the early church, martyrdom happened in public. You at least had the consolation of when you were in the arena about to be torn apart by animals or burned at the stake. At least you could say to yourself, if this mattered to you, okay, I can try to give consolation to those who are with me. I can, at least people will see what I'm going through. Imagine how much worse it is if someone is torturing you physically, interrogating you, and there is no one there to see it, there is no one there to hear it, you are alone with your interrogator or several interrogators. Next slide, please. When most of us think of the new martyrs, or when we think about what life in Russia used to be like, we think about the imperial family. Here, many of them are, looking very nice indeed and embodying the old order. Next slide, please. And they were replaced by, it seems to us very quickly, almost overnight, by Soviet rule. And precisely because so much time has gone by, in fact, precisely 100 years, can you go back to the previous slide? It's hard for us to imagine how one can go so quickly from this, next slide please, to that. And if you look on your handouts, whether they are in English or in Russian, you will, of course, understand that a society does not change overnight. Russia entered the First World War, the Great War, in 1914. That when the February Revolution happened, in the start of 1917, let me stress that the Bolsheviks had nothing to do with it. The Bolsheviks had nothing to do with Nicholas II losing his job. Nothing. Lenin was in Switzerland. Trotsky was in New York. Stalin was in Siberia. They were not there. It was not their fault, right? And I stress this because far too often we say, oh, okay, well, yes, we know the Bolsheviks are evil. We know that communism was evil. So clearly it's an evil system and this is why this all happened, and isn't that bad? Okay. Is it actually spiritually useful to think about it from this point of view? In the same way, if one goes to services in church during Holy Week, remember the services, Great and Holy Thursday, Great and Holy Friday, is it spiritually helpful to say to yourself, wow, I'm glad I'm not Jewish, or wow, I'm glad I'm not a Roman soldier, because really the death of Jesus was their fault. It wasn't my fault. And if we think that, we are basically missing the whole point of the services of Holy Week, which is to say it's not the fault of the Jews, it's not the fault of the Roman soldiers, it is the fault of the sins of humanity that put Jesus up on the cross. So when we think about what it was that brought the new martyrs to power, let us not be complacent. Because in fact, people often say, oh, 1913, Russia was this amazing country, this amazing empire, economy great, everything great. Yeah, true. So war starts in 1914. Russia is the empire among the other empires that are fighting the war that actually does not make it successfully to the end of the war for all sorts of reasons. Infrastructure, trains dedicated to the military effort, lots of refugees streaming into the country from occupied areas. Partly the February Revolution happens because of the weather, believe it or not, which is to say, those of you who go to the university in a place like Albany, and I realize maybe many of you don't, but I do. But you know what it's like when the winter has been really cold, really harsh, and suddenly there's a warm snap and everybody is out there in their t-shirts. One of the reasons that the February Revolution happened is that there was a freak warm spell, and people started coming out on the streets, including high school students and people who worked in bakeries, partly because yeah, there are people out there demonstrating on the streets, but what does it take for you yourself to come out of your house and demonstrate? One of the factors is, well, the weather is great and my friends are out there. So, don't laugh. Alexandra, the Empress Alexandra, wrote a note to her husband saying, I wish it would get cold again, because then people would just go back in their houses. But for whatever set of reasons, go to your handout, the February Revolution happens. And Nicholas II is convinced by his generals that it would really be a good thing for Russia if he were to abdicate. He did. Nobody held a gun to his head. Nobody said, you have to do this. He abdicated for himself. He abdicated for his son. His brother Michael himself abdicated from the throne as well, which he was never technically actually on, but Nicholson can talk about that in greater detail. And the country descended into chaos. So when we think about how we moved from February to October, it did not happen overnight. The population became progressively more aggrieved, etc. But I stress this because all of the three people that we're going to be talking about today, none of them expected this to happen any more than anybody expected this to happen. If you had asked anybody in January 1917, you will never believe where we're going to be in December. If you had actually said, guess what, the emperor's going to abdicate, there's going to be a provisional government, it's going to fall apart, the Bolsheviks are going to come to power, he would have said, you are insane. And yet this is what happened. So next slide, please. So the new martyrs are interesting to us precisely because, like everyone else in the Russian Empire, they did not expect to have happen what indeed happened. I would like to call your attention to the young priest Ian Kachurov, second from the left, sitting in the middle, next to his wife. He has, in this picture, he has recently been ordained, and he in Russia, and he is about to go and be a priest in Chicago, in fact. And after 10 years, he comes back to Russia, grows his hair longer again, and he is the first, next slide please, he is the first new martyr of Russia, because when in Tsarskoye Selo, which to those of you who've never been to Imperial Russia, is just outside St. Petersburg, a short distance, when the mobs started coming out onto the streets, those of you who remember the LA riots or any other riots, he thought it would be, because of course the clergy started asking themselves, what can we do? There's been a revolution. There are armed soldiers walking in the streets, people are firing. He decided it would be a good idea to have a cross procession, a kresny hod, to try to calm people down. And he was, there are different accounts, by the way, because eyewitness accounts aren't entirely sure. Some people say he was shot, some people say he was trampled to death by the mob. It's not clear. But what I would like to stress is he does not have a death sentence from the Bolsheviks. He is killed by an angry mob. And the thing for us to think about, among others, is would one oneself have been in that angry mob? What impels some people to shoot a priest, to trample a priest in the street? And one of the things that's very important for us to bear in mind is that it makes a difference when a very large part of the adult male population, and when I say adult, I mean anyone over the age of 18, has been at the front, has been at war. All of them come back, and the people who come back, they've all had the experience of holding a gun in their hands. Many of them have already killed people. What has happened to the light, please? Many of them have already done some form of violent act. And so, when we think about who is carrying out all of these actions, who is carrying out the mob violence that occurs, I would suggest that no small part of it is precisely that the country has been at war, and are we getting things aligned?
Yeah, I think.
Yes? I'm not convinced. But of course I have a little say.
Yeah, it's gonna turn back on.
What's that?
It's gonna turn back on.
It will?
Hopefully.
All right, well, blessed are you who have not seen but have believed. so they tell me. Okay, so priest Yaakov Shurov, in other words, is or should be a lesson to us that he's someone who was not expecting to be a martyr in any size, shape, or form. He was just doing his job, or so he thought, by going out into the street. But actually, this is already the first thing for us to think about. He could have said to himself, there's a lot of mobs out in the streets, there are crazy people, they're shooting. Maybe I should just stay at home and lie low until this blows over, and then have the kresny hod afterwards. No, it was his call. He thought it was important for people to see the example of a priest coming out, of the church coming out to try to quiet the population. It did not succeed. I'm very worried. I'm very worried because visuals are absolutely the key to this presentation. What? What?
The light has
Okay, if you say so. Well,
it's coming back.
good. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Good. All right, look closely because this image may vanish for all you know. Okay, our next new martyr is someone who was a lawyer, and I'm very sad that Ludia Yudkovskaya cannot be here because I'm dedicating his case to her. Ian Mikhailovich Kovsharov, who was just another clever attorney from Odessa, and there were many. Like many clever young people from Odessa, he went from Odessa to the state capital and had a very successful career as a lawyer. He served as a defense attorney, a state counsel, and indeed, ironically, defended in some cases revolutionaries against the Tsarist government. So ironic that he became first an assistant to the legal counsel of the Alexandra Nevskaya Lavra in St. Petersburg. Then that was between 1907 and 1912. From then onwards, he became the legal counsel of the Alexandra Nevskaya Lavra. And we need to bear this in mind, because martyrdoms don't happen overnight. It's not as if overnight a decree goes out, every single cleric is rounded up, etc. No. Civil war was going on. It's not yet clear how things are going to shake themselves out. The church and the parishes are involved in a lot of legal cases. They need legal help. And indeed, he is the kind of person that Yulia Litkovskaya would have liked, because he was smart, he was sarcastic, he was articulate. But I stress, he did not quit his job as legal aid counsel, as the acting attorney for the Alexandra Nevskaya Lavra, when it looked as if things were getting dicey. He helped Metropolitan Benjamin of Petrograd, etc. Next slide, please. And although he tried pointing out completely calmly to the people who were prosecuting him that they had no legal case against him or anyone else there, that they were perfectly within their rights to defend the church from the seizure of valuables, that didn't fly, and he was shot together with Metropolitan Benjamin of Petrograd. Next image, please. Second, actually I guess he is third. Third in our gallery today is Yuri Petrovich Novitsky, who actually knew Kovsharov. Although Kovsharov was from Odessa, Novitsky was from Uman, which is to say also in present-day Ukraine. He also went to Petrograd and had a career there. But interestingly, he was extremely active in children with special needs, worked to have schools for kids with special needs set up, and was also active in trying to find homes and shelters for kids of convicts who were sent to Siberia. Next image, please. He also taught in a law school, and when the trial, there's an image of it on the lower right, when the trial happened, he was initially very, very calm and actually tried to take upon himself some of the accusations that were hurled against some of the priests, because he knew that the priests had small kids at home, and so he said, no, blame it on me. But in the last minute, he couldn't help it and broke down and started crying because he had a 14-year-old daughter, and he knew that she would be left alone. And again, tragic that he who had all his life, he was in his late 30s when this happened, all his life he had tried to help kids with special needs. He had, like Kovsharov, thought that everyone should have a free trial. He was very influenced by the ideas of Christian socialism, had read a lot of Dostoevsky, was completely opposed to the death penalty, and he also was sentenced to shooting. Why do I bring this up? Because these are the kinds of people who could have and should have had normal, productive lives as members of society. They were not given that chance. Next slide, please. The last of the new martyrs that we are going to be talking about is in some ways particularly striking. This is Tatiana Grimblit, who, unlike the first two, who were born in 1878 and 1882 respectively, and therefore were grown men when the revolution happened, she was born in 1903. So in 1917, she would have been, any kids who know arithmetic out there?
14.
Born in 1903, how old is she in 1917?
14.
But actually, you're right. It depends when in the year we're talking about. But yes, she was 14 in 1917. At the age of 17 in 1920, she started working in fact, interestingly, also in a school for special needs in Siberia. What makes her so interesting and what makes her so powerful for us as an example? She took to heart the words of the service where, like, you know how often you hear in the litany, for those in prison, for those in, like, and you just go, yeah, who knows anybody in jail, and you just keep going. Well, in fact, she was struck by the fact, and this was another quote from the liturgy, she was struck by the idea that some people had nobody to send them care packages. Those of you who've been away to university, or if you're a kid and you go on any kind of a trip, your mom gives you a little care package with, a brownie, a juice, something. And part of it is that it's really nice to have the cookie and the juice, but it's also really nice to know that somebody is looking out for you. Have those of us sitting in this room, with the possible exception of the men in black, thought about the loneliness of being an arrested monk or an arrested bishop without a family to care for you? Because the people who got care packages in prisons were usually people with surviving family members. Her cause in life began the assembly of care packages for people who did not have anyone else to make care packages for them. And this was what she started getting arrested for. She was arrested numerous times, I stress. It's not as if she does this once, she's arrested, that's it, it's all over. No, she starts doing this in 1920 because she lives in, Siberia, where there's no shortage of people being sent to do time. And so but also she does something else, which is very important. She not only prepares care packages, things like warm socks, and by the way, if you've never frozen in a really cold room for lack of warm socks, you have no idea how much it means to get a pair of warm socks, how much it means to have a little piece of soap if you don't have soap, how much it means to get a little bit of toothpaste if you don't have toothpaste. These are the basic things that she brought to people. She made collections in all of the parishes in Omsk where she lived. She started getting medical training so that she could be of more help. I would like to read to you an extract from a letter that she received from a fellow new martyr, Bishop John Pashin of Rilsk, who got one of her care packages and one of the letters that she sent. And this is actually also really important because sometimes when you've been unjustly accused and the world has completely forgotten you, or so you think, the psychological importance of getting a package and also getting a letter addressed to you by name. I've not been forgotten. This is what he writes. I received your letter and I do not know how to thank you for it. It breathes with such warmth, love, and good cheer that the day on which I received it was among the happiest for me. I read it 3 times, and then I read it again to my friends, Vladika Nicholas and Father Serge, my spiritual father. How wisely and mercifully the Lord has arranged it, so that you, having once experienced a serious illness, went on to study medicine, and now work in the field of treating the sick and suffering, earning a little money, essential for you to live on and for helping others. How many tears will be wiped away? How much suffering will be eased by this holy work? You work in a medical lab, a pharmacy, wonderful. Remember the holy great martyr, Consilimon the healer, with his box of medicines in his hands, as he's depicted in the icons, and work in the name of the Lord, labor for the glory of God. May the sign of the Holy Cross guard all of the medicines spread into the powers of poured into vials. Another one of her correspondents, Bishop Averki Kedra of Volhynia and Zhytomyr, who would also be later executed. wrote to her and also thanking her ardently, and then saying, this is the important thing for us, I rejoice in and bow down before your struggle of unwavering devotion to the Creator and before those painful afflictions, trials, and suffering through which your path has gone, leading to the victory in your soul of Christ over Belial, of heaven on earth, of light over darkness. That is a real bishop, which is to say, real bishops, real priests understand that their flock is also going through what they are going through. Nobody is making her do this. It is not her duty to do this. This is above and beyond the call of duty. And the mark of a great bishop, the mark of any great leader like Suvorov, is precisely to have everyone who is placed in your care, who is underneath you, want to go to the wall for you, because they know that you appreciate it and you are not taking them for granted. The model for us, let us never forget, is Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, taking care of others. That is indeed what she did. It is also important to bear in mind when Tatiana Grigoryeva was being interrogated, and the first question they ask in an interrogation, in case you're wondering, is, who are your accomplices? She never named names. She never said, even though other clergy were helping her out and so on, she never named anyone else, never implicated anyone else when it would have been the easiest thing to do and maybe would have gotten her off. Next slide, please. And so when we think of one image of, like one rosy image of Soviet rule, it is worthwhile for us to bear in mind what lay behind it and beneath it. Next slide, please. And the question is, that by the way is me a few years ago, so it's like a more flattering picture. But the question for us is, and something that I asked myself as I was working on this, how might all of this affect me? How can or should this affect the way that I live my life? Other than perhaps saying, okay, I'm not going to name names, I will try to be ready. That is actually something for all of us to think about. More on that in a moment. Next slide, please. But this actually brings us to a really interesting question, and this is what I'm going to close with because we're batting it over to an art historian, and that is, what is the best way to represent the new martyrs? When I had, as a child, a conversation with my mother about icons of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, I said to her, having just read a little bit about Byzantine iconography, and I said to her in that snooty 12-year-old way, I said, you know, this icon of Saint Seraphim of Sarov that you have isn't really a great icon because it's kind of realistic, and icons aren't supposed to be realistic. And she, the good mother, cut me off and said, it is not appropriate, this is an interesting question for us, it is not appropriate to depict people in a completely stylized way if they are our contemporaries and we have seen them. So let us actually, because this can be part of our discussion, let us look at some of the icons of new martyrs and ponder on whether this is an effective icon or not. Okay, here's one, next one. Okay, this is really realistic. Does it need to be that realistic? Next image, please. This one is also getting, like, the face is kind of realistic, the rest of it is stylized. Next image, please. This is a portrait of Saint Seraphim of Sarov painted during his life, so you can see he looks much more realistic. Next image, please. Now, what about the imperial family? Because they are the ones who are depicted in lots of different ways, and Nick will be talking about this. Should we go for Neo-Byzantine? Next. Slightly contemporary, you will note that the daughters are wearing the same white dresses that they wore in life, and they're wearing their coronation robes. Next image. Really contemporary, actually, okay, next image. Kind of neither, where it's sort of Byzantine but sort of realistic at the same time. Or in simple white robes. Next image. But one thing is very important for us. You will note that the icon to which Saint Seraphim of Sarov is praying is a Western-style icon. And this argument and this image is used for, it doesn't matter what style an icon is painted in as long as it does you spiritual good to pray in front of it. Next question. Next slide, please. This is a horrible image. It is a horrible image because the men that we are seeing in this image are about to be beheaded by the men in black behind them. Next image, please. This, however, it's also them, but it's a very different image. And I would like us to think about the difference between depicting them as almost faceless victims with the knives held in front of their heads, as opposed to looking at them, looking at their faces, and knowing, as they know, that in a very short amount of time, they are about to be beheaded. And not only are they going to be beheaded, but this is actually going to be filmed and posted over the internet. Let us ponder on what martyrdom means, what the representation of martyrdom means in our day, when martyrdom doesn't even have the dignity of having it be done in private, but it actually appears. And so the question then for us is, and it's a very serious question, is how do we look at their faces, try to draw on their example as a source of strength in our lives without dwelling too much, because it doesn't actually do spiritual good, without dwelling too much on the horrible way in which they met their ends. And a lot of saints have been beheaded historically. We know this. My saint was beheaded historically. Beheading is what usually happens at the end of a saint's life when all of the other things have not worked out. But how does one depict this in a spiritually useful way? Next slide, please. One Serbian iconographer came up with this image, which I actually have very mixed feelings about, because again, it's still very visceral. Next image. Does it make a difference if one only looks at part of the image and sees Christ above the heads of the victims? Next image, please. So as you look at this image, ponder on whether it would make more of a difference to you if you were, let's say, looking at your icons before you go out the door in the morning, trying to get some spiritual strength for the day. Would it matter more to you if you saw her face looking out for you, taken the day before she is executed, or is it more useful to see her in an iconographic style with a care package to remind us of what her feat was? Next image, please. And perhaps the strongest example of this, and the one that I'm going to close with, is an image with which we are probably familiar. This is an image from the basement of the Ipatiev house, where the imperial family was first told that they were going to pose for a photograph to tell people that they were safe, and that indeed they were first shot, and those who survived, because there were clouds, it wasn't obvious who was immediately dead and who wasn't, were bayoneted. And one can have some sense for just how bad it was based on the kind of damage that was done to the room. They did not want to die this way. Nurse Tatiana Grimbit did not want to be shot. Kovsharov did not want to be shot. Metropolitan Benjamin of Petrograd did not want to be shot. Next image, please. No one in this room wants to be beheaded, and yet everyone in this room thinks that they are an Orthodox Christian, and we all try in our various ways to be Orthodox Christians. I hope for my sake that I'm never faced with the possibility, because I honestly don't know what I would do if faced with the possibility. But I think perhaps the most important thing to remember is that before all of the people that we saw were faced with martyrdom, they were trying to do the best that they could. They were trying to show mercy to everyone in our own lives. So I leave you with this extract from the parable of the Good Samaritan, the one who found someone lying by the side of the road. The priest went by, the Levite went by, and a stranger showed mercy on him. So perhaps the strongest lesson of the new martyrs for us is to remember that the church consists not only of dead nuns and priests and bishop. The church also consists of people like every single person sitting in this room who, when faced with a strong trial, found it in them to come down on the side of Jesus Christ. May we all try to be worthy of their example. Thank you.
For that inspiring lecture, and I'd like to open up discussions and questions and answers. Отец Никодим, please sit next to Владыка. We invite you to come to the panel discussion. Пожалуйста. Владыка, would you please open up our discussions to comments maybe to what you heard and how you feel as well?
Would you speak in English? Yes. First, to thank Borisovны for her wonderful talk and opening our eyes to maybe a new side of the new martyrs that we really never thought about. Спасибо. Just my comment is, we started off your talk with how do these new martyrs relate to me? We are here in America. Some of us are American, maybe part Russian, and so forth. But I think the fact that we are gathered here in Manhattan 100 years later discussing this important topic, it obviously does affect us, each of us in a special way. Practically, we need to remember that Patriarch Tikhon served right next door, a few blocks away. He walked these streets and he returned to Russia, was elected patriarch, and became a new martyr. Metropolitan Anastasi Gribanovsky, his portrait is here in the corner. He served here at the synod. He lived here, reposed in the Lord here, and he was the father confessor to Grand Duchess Elizabeth. He met with her at the Martha and Mary Convent, probably had tea with her, talked with her. And here he was among us in New York. So of course I think the martyrs do relate to us. I do wish Vladika Anastasi was alive today. I'd have a million questions for him. But I think that's important to realize that wherever we are, I think the new martyrs affect each of us, and we should give them proper reverence. And as today, for me, there were some things that were open to my eyes. We should continue to learn about them, because the new martyrs, the total is endless. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So those are my comments I wanted to share.
Спасибо. Отец Никодим, если можете тоже выступить, сказать свои мнения, доклады и вообще на тему. Степан может перевести и тех, которые нуждаются.
Владыка, благословите. Добрый вечер, высокое собрание. Спасибо большое, Надежда Борисовна. Я очень рад лично с вами познакомиться. Я читал вашу работу, посвященную святому праведному Иоанну Кронштадтскому. Я вас искренне благодарю за такой великолепный, подлинно христианский взгляд на историю церкви. И вот на примере святого праведного Иоанна Кронштадтского оценки, которые вот должны выноситься действительно церковными христианскими историками. Потому что вообще тема новейшей истории Русской Православной Церкви до сего дня бывает, имеет такие оценки весьма как бы крайне противоположные. То есть кто-то идеализирует какие-то вещи в этой истории, связанные, может быть, с политическим, общественным устройством жизни нашего бывшего общего Отечества. Кто-то, наоборот, стремится отвязаться напрочь от этого, говоря о каком-то новом времени, новом видении и так далее. И то, что вот сегодня я услышал, я думаю, все присутствующие здесь, вы прекрасно проиллюстрировали вот эту преемственность в поколениях истории Церкви Христовой, которая продолжается до сего дня. И эта история всегда пишется кровью мучеников, как это было в самом начале существования Церкви Христовой здесь на земле, так и до сего дня. И вот в этом контексте как раз и возможно рассмотреть трагические события столетней давности, которых памятной дате, к которой мы все приближаемся и которой посвящено настоящее собрание. Именно в этом контексте революция 17 года, переворот большевистский и все связанные с этим события и история новых мучеников Церкви Русской представляются не как безнадежная трагедия, жертвами которой мы должны как бы себя ощущать и вот влачить свое существование вот с осознанием там обиженных, угнетенных людей, а именно людей, которые принадлежат к этой истории, являются наследниками новых мучеников Церкви Русской, как подлинно победители, как христиане, которые исполнили и исполняют свое служение здесь на земле. В этом контексте, в котором вы представили историю новомучеников, действительно события 17-18 года и последующих лет можно рассматривать как действительно явление удивительного, премудрого промысла Божия, которое вернул Русской Православной Церкви, ее чадам в Отечестве и в рассеянии суть того, чему призвана Церковь Христова здесь на земле. Не обслуживание каких-то отдельных там политических интересов, не защита только какого-то одного общественного государственного устройства, а именно вернуло сознание и пастырям, архипастырям, духовенству и мирянам смысл и суть веры Христовой. В 19 году, сейчас точно не помню, 3 святителя оказались в пленении в одном из католических монастырей. Это был преснопамятный святитель Антоний Храповицкий, архиепископ Евлогий Георгиевский и епископ, викарий Киевской митрополии на тот момент Никодим Кратков, который впоследствии стал архиепископом Костромским. После этого пленения, которое замечательно описал Евлогий в своих записках, каждый разошелся в свою сторону, являя таким образом, в общем-то, и другие рамки, которые иногда пытаются навязать Церкви Христовой, не препятствовали нам всем и будущим поколениям православных христиан, не препятствовали увидеть живого Христа в той миссии, которую осуществляет русская церковь в Отечестве и в России. Вот чтобы не повторить той трагедии, когда русские крещенные люди, воспитанные в православии, которые учились в церковно-приходских школах, чтобы потом снова не стали убивать своих пастырей, архипастырей, властодержащих и так далее, как это произошло. Страшной иллюстрацией, я заканчиваю, страшной иллюстрацией, очень страшной иллюстрацией того, какая трагедия произошла именно внутри, в лоне Русской Православной Церкви. И большевики здесь ни при чем. Здоровую собаку блохи не кусали. Та вот иллюстрация той трагедии, которая случилась внутри православного русского общества накануне революции, это такая история 14 июля 1918 года. Юровский, прекрасно зная, что через несколько дней ему собственноручно придется расстреливать ни в чем не повинных детей, всю семью и слуг последнего российского императора, приводит к ним священника, сам присутствует за этим богослужением и, прощаясь с отцом Иоанном Сторожевым, крестится и говорит: «Слава Богу, от сердца отлегло». Вы представляете, какая трагедия бывает в церкви, в среде верующих, когда каждый пытается мерить по себе, по своим представлениям, по своей какой-то похоти, предпочтение мерить на себя христианство, являясь братьями и сестрами во Христе, в то же время каким трагическим разделением приводит вот эта вот подмена подлинного христианства какими-то другими мотивами и так далее, и так далее. И то, что мы собрали здесь, в Америке, и опыт служения Русской Православной Церкви в Америке, вы знаете, он уникален. Я тоже думаю, что не без промысла Божия святитель Тихон, который служил здесь на протяжении многих лет и многого здесь добился по распространению проповеди православия, стал патриархом не случайно. Вот эта его американская прививка дала ему возможность вот в те самые сложные первые дни существования советской власти сохранить церковь, максимально оградить ее от еще больших потрясений и расколов, которые могли иметь место быть, потому что вот его вот эта доступность людям, близость к людям, вот это какое-то непосредственное общение с ними сделали свое дело, но это он приобрел здесь, в Америке. И сегодня наш опыт служения здесь, вы знаете, он, я думаю, очень много может помочь нашим братьям и сестрам в России. Здесь мы осуществляем свое служение, не являясь ни государственной, слава Богу, религией, никаким образом не поддерживаемой никакими государственными институтами. И это дает нам возможность заниматься сугубо нашими внутренними, духовными, поставленными целями, которые стоят перед церковью. Опять-таки не ассоциироваясь, не проникаясь ни с какими другими общественными государственными институтами, которые могли бы отвлечь нас от главной цели – проповеди о Христе и нашей жизни в нем. Спасибо вам большое за ваш доклад. Я думаю, что люди, которые не являются, может быть, русскими по происхождению, которые не имеют опыта жизни в России, которые сегодня были приглашены и услышали ваш доклад, для себя по-новому тоже открыли русскую историю и удивились, наверное, подвигу наших новых мучеников, продолжателями которого мы сегодня являемся.
Спасибо, отец. Большое спасибо. Как раз затронул очень такие важные темы за сегодняшнее обсуждение. Nicholas Nicholson, could you please maybe comment on your thoughts of the presentation today and of the topic of the Holy New Martyrs briefly? Thank you.
I'm honored and slightly confused to be here. I was transported, in fact, by Dr. Kiczenko's lecture, simply because as someone who has very recently accepted Orthodoxy, I'm unfamiliar with the greater number of the new martyrs. There is an endless litany of names, all of whom are of equal importance in their sacrifice and in living a life in Christ and becoming, as Nadежды Борисовны said so beautifully, martyrs without their own permission and against their will. And I was asked here because of my ostensible expertise in the pre-revolutionary life of the Romanov family. Now, they are front and center at the icon of the new martyrs and in the understanding of the new martyrs to the rest of the world, because they are quite simply the most famous and most photographed Russians at the end of the 19th century. Their photographs of each other and of their family and of their lives were made against their will public because their collections were dispersed, their photographs were sold, their private letters passed out of their hands into the hands of family members and into the West. They were published. We don't know this kind, we do not have the immediate access to to the lives of the French royal family or the British royal family or the German Kaiser's family because their personal documents weren't thrown to the winds in 1918. And as a result, we know more about their private lives than we often do about other historical figures. As a result, they have been ambassadors for orthodoxy in the West. And I think that perhaps the reason I am here is because they were the ones that touched me. I read about them in terrible works of Western nonfiction, written by people who spoke no Russian, who had no background in orthodoxy, who looked at their stories without understanding their context, who turned them into cartoons and musicals and elaborate MGM films, and who presented the world of Imperial Russia in a caricature, and that was very attractive. It's a fairy tale, and it's something that draws people in. But after the family was made saints, and after the new martyrs were canonized in Russia as well as in the West, and after the archives were opened, and more material came out, and the truth became more readily available to those who read Russian, and in the West there are still very few, their lives began to take shape not just as an extracted bit of Russian history or culture, but because they are an intrinsic part of a life lived in faith. I was very fortunate last year to work on an annotated translation of the diaries of Grand Duchess Tatiana Nikolaevna, which had never been published in English before. And I was stunned as I went through her letters and her diary entries to really have the chance of living the World War I and the beginning of the revolution in real time as we translated and did research day by day and sometimes minute by minute and hour by hour of the path of the Grand Duchesses and the family through the end of the empire, their early arrest, their time in Siberia up until the end. And what was very helpful to me was I was looking at their lives, which if you look at them outside of the Orthodox context, seeing an endless cycle of meaningless church services and dinners and parties. And Nadежды Борисовны said to me once, as I was sort of complaining about this, she said, "Молебens always happen for a reason. And so you should look at the calendar." And that was an enormous shift in my understanding of the family. And it reminded me that many years ago, I was actually in this room with a woman I care about a great deal, and she said, "You'll never understand them if you're not Orthodox." And I still don't understand them, but I now understand the context into which they fit and the decisions that they made. They no longer seem out of touch to me. They no longer seem wishy-washy or weak-willed. They no longer seem to be removed from their understanding of the people who lived in Russia in that period. They are part of an enormous fabric of people who live day to day, minute by minute, with full faith in God and in His will for them. They were people who abandoned all personal choice. They allowed their lives to be dictated by their faith and by the structure of their empire. They had almost no personal preferences, and they moved through life as examples and as models to their own family and to the people who looked up to them. They remained that for me because they were what drew me to the understanding of the rest of the martyrs. And we could talk endlessly about politics, and we could talk endlessly about rank, and I could give you a litany of the things they owned and the places they lived. I don't know where I put my keys this morning, but I can tell you how long the train of Grand Duchess Elizabeth was at her wedding. But I draw enormous strength from the example set by this family. And as someone who was not born Russian and was not born in Russia, it's important for me to remember that the Empress and her sister were converts. They weren't Russian. They were born in Germany. They were raised Lutherans. And like many of us, they accepted something that was strange and foreign. And now you can't imagine anyone more Russian than I would have been. You know, they're at the heart of Russia even today. So that's an example, and one I'm very grateful to have had.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you so much. Very important for us to touch base on these other aspects that we don't always see. We're always associating them with the church service, but it's important for us to personalize it as well sometimes so that we can remember in our daily lives how to live accordingly and to copy them as well spiritually. I'd like to open up for discussions, questions and answers, and maybe this discussion. I know there are some people that would like to open up other aspects and thoughts, and we'll try with the panel here to address them the best that we can. And is there anybody specific? Please stand up. And
it's apparent to me that Russian culture draws from the 7th century, 10th century, 14th century, the good and not always so good Byzantine Orthodox culture. That dichotomy, I feel is necessary. I should mention the name of Carl Jung, a psychologist who wrote in 1930 his book, Modern Man, in Search of the Soul. Whereupon he speaks of the archaeal man archaeal, a new atom or a number of pseudo-atoms, because he differentiates between the modern and the pseudo-modern. With that, we must continue on to the fact that he doesn't speak of the fall of that man or men into primitive societies that form primitive mindsets, and though they might have modern equipment around them, and falling further back because of the dichotomy between genders, social standings, and their own interpretations of the present. The fact is, we don't want to whitewash any walls like Paul of Tarsus spoke of Herod doing, by denial of what happened, and saying that we ourselves will rise above it, and our group consciousness will not make any prisoners of any individual consciousness. Because if we do that, then we won't have that structure, we won't have that wall as a support system to rise up from whence we have fallen.
Thank you. Sarah, maybe you have a question? Christopher, please.
Yeah, I was wondering what is the last glorified martyr that is known, in terms of chronologically? Obviously, there were a lot of them, especially in the 1930s. Do we know what is the latest one that we have documentation of today?
I think we'll continue to glorify the martyrs. We find more out about them.
Right, but I mean, currently the last known one chronologically.
Well, German martyr Alexander Schmuel was martyred in 46, 47.
But by the Soviet government.
Again, to pinpoint the last one, I think, is very difficult.
Well, actually, just open up your laptop, open up mine, look up the Spisak, the canonized saints. I mean, I don't know.
I looked it up. It's very hard to find because.
Oh, really? Okay.
Again, there was obviously severe persecution in the 30s, but how long did severe persecution continue in Soviet Russia? What decade do you think people were still being persecuted?
Скорее всего, может быть, имен этих людей мы не знаем, потому что еще не совсем изучено хрущевское гонение на русское православие 50-х, начало 60-х годов. Тогда не было таких показательных, может быть, процессов, но очень многие священнослужители и миряне пострадали в результате его вот такой жестко выраженной антирелигиозной политики. Многие попадали в тюрьмы под вымышленными уже обвинениями не за контрреволюцию, не за проповедь Евангелия, а за какие-то там неуплату налогов или еще какие-то припаянные обвинения. Те священники, епископы, миряне, которые занимали активную, как бы христианскую позицию, они уже весьма так подло были преследуемы под вымышленными какими-то предлогами. Поэтому я думаю, что история новомучеников церкви русской еще не закончена. Еще предстоит какой-то период времени, когда мы узнаем имена новых мучеников, пострадавших уже в 50-е и послевоенные годы.
Спасибо, отец Никодим. Есть еще вопросы? Questions?
Yeah, I have a question about what was said before about Dostoevsky's idea of Christian socialism.
No, I didn't say Dostoevsky. I said that he was influenced by Dostoevsky and by Christian socialism. I did not call Dostoevsky a Christian socialist.
Oh, but I see some
Thank you for clearing that up.
Christian socialism in Dostoevsky. My brother's Carolina, for example, Prince Miusov articulates this idea. And then in the Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, Christ even kisses the lips of the Grand Inquisitor, who is supposed to be the most evil of the socialists. But what an opportune moment it was when the revolution happened for Christian socialism to become a reality.
You see? I don't know about that. I mean, maybe it did, but certainly not in Russia.
Не пойдем к нашим страждущим братьям, к голодному люду пойдем, that they used to say. What could be more Christian than that? But
I'm not telling you that.
what was the policy of the Orthodox Church to the revolution in February and in October? Was there any shift between those days?
Well, of course there was, but probably the single most important event of 1917, 1918 is that there was a major church council going on. The first all-Russian church council that had been convened since before Peter the Great. So the church, I actually think it would be very hard to say the church had this position. The thing that made 1917, 18 so interesting is that the church was carrying out a council in which it was discussing things that it hadn't had a chance to discuss before. And actually, it was a great gift to the Orthodox Church that, in fact, that the council had started to meet before the October Revolution happened, so that they actually were already mustered and were able to try to articulate a position, to try to come up with one. There was, as you know, there was a range of opinions within the Orthodox Church. Different hierarchs, as Nicodemus pointed that out to us in the three different paths. Some of the clergy joined the so-called Living Church, which was a tool of the Bolsheviks. So I would say there was not a party line in the Orthodox Church, the way that there was a party line in the Bolshevik.
So was there a policy of neutrality?
There was a range of opinions. Patriarch Sita would not take sides in the Civil War, for example.
Thank you.
The council did elect the patriarch.
Yes.
Of all things.
Yeah.
Amidst all this, patriarch was elected.
Any questions?
Yeah, I think I have two questions. One is rather straightforward, the other a little more philosophical. So the simple one is, how many approximately new martyrs are there? Approximately. And how many laymen and how many...
Did you not check your handout for that answer? That's a straightforward question.
Well, but it says that, like for example, in 1981 when the canonization happened, there was no list, right? Because the names are really not known, so maybe
the
since...
Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was in no position to go to the archives and...
No, exactly. So since then, many of the archives have been opened, and so
Yeah.
maybe now we have more data. So approximately how many clergy members and how many laymen were actually executed in the 20th century?
Well, now that's actually a very interesting question, because people who are executed are not necessarily martyrs. And
Yeah.
that's, according to the statistic that I have here, In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia canonized 813 new martyrs and confessors and approved 112 who had been canonized before. I don't think right now there's more officially than 2,000 whose names we know, whose vitae we have, etc. But it's actually a really interesting issue, right? What does it take to be named a new martyr and a
Like
confessor?
Michael had been killed just a few weeks before Nicholas II, but he's not considered the same.
Right, exactly. Or there are some people who were tortured and died under torture, but who named names and are not considered martyrs because they named names. There are people who were in New York on 9/11, Orthodox Christians who were working downtown and who died that day, but they're not automatically considered martyrs. So, I mean, it's the interesting thing is that historically, the Orthodox Church assumed that if somebody was a martyr, that wiped clean everything else. But what is a martyr? What is a confessor? That's why they have the commissions to sort that out.
Yeah, which brings us to another question. Why did the Moscow Patriarchate canonize the royal family as passion bearers and the church abroad canonized them as martyrs? And is there really a difference?
I think I should back that over to somebody from the Moscow Patriarchate.
В вашей работе интересное такое есть наблюдение по поводу того же канонизации Иоанна Кронштадтского. Подход к канонизации в двух частях Русской Православной Церкви. В 1964 году Русская Православная Церковь за границей канонизировала Кронштадтского пастыря, и вы справедливо, скорее всего, отметили, я не знаю, обижу я сейчас кого-то или нет, что таким образом Церковь продемонстрировала неприятие революции, то есть неприятие той истории, которая произошла в 17 году, и как бы в его образе канонизировала и историю русской церкви, той, которая она была, и что другой истории быть не может. Надо к ней стремиться. Царь-батюшка, я не знаю, Синод, Святейший и так далее. Мы канонизировали в 1990 году Иоанна Кронштадтского без уже вот такой вот какой-то подоплеки, указывая на праведность его жизни, зафиксированные чудеса и исполнение им Евангелия именно в пасторском служении. Помощь страждущим, нищим и так далее, и так далее. Я не знаю, сейчас, безусловно, вы знаете, может быть рано отвечать на этот вопрос. Все-таки 10 лет воссоединения по милости Божией произошли, но все равно это еще не тот период времени, за который можно прийти к каким-то одинаковым, точным критериям, по которым мы канонизировали или будем еще канонизировать кого-то. То есть это все-таки не какая-то такая чисто канцелярская процедура, а это все-таки какой-то живой опыт церкви, церковного предания, молитвенного общения нашего. То есть, может быть, пока и не стоит отдавать какой-то конкретный однозначный ответ, чтобы этим ответом снова не прийти к каким-то разделениям, непониманиям. Зачем? Мы с большим радостью и удовольствием прославляем лики святых новомучеников и исповедников, великих князей, которые канонизированы в Русской Православной Церкви за границей, которые пострадали с Елизаветой Федоровной, в общеправославном, в общецерковном почитании их имен в России еще нет, но это нам не мешает, будучи здесь, участвовать в этих праздниках и почитать их память и молиться им. Поэтому время, немножко время. Время и молитвенное общение все приведут к согласию.
Can I actually also add, I don't think it matters. I mean, or in any case, does it matter if there are 2,000 or 4,000 canonized? I mean, because at the end of almost every litany or panicula, there's some phrase to the effect of, имена ты их Господи веси, in the eyes of God.
Right, but from the purely historical perspective, so that we have the numbers. The Russian Orthodox Church before the revolution, as it is today, was the largest поместная церковь, right? And what happened by 1939, there were maybe 100 churches still operating, and there were, I think, 4 bishops.
Yeah.
4 bishops,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
And so to understand how many people were actually killed in 30 years between 1917 and the beginning of World War II. Do we have that number, or is it still a mystery to historians?
I don't think it's a mystery, but I think that there are several groups of historians and church people who are researching it. There are websites and stuff. I can go and look it up and try to find information.
Большое спасибо. Thank you so much, Professor Надежда Киценко, for your wonderful presentation. And I'd like to also thank the members of the panel discussion, Vladika and Mrs. Nikodin and Nicholas, for giving up your time to participate in this very important topic. This evening, we were organized by the Prince Vladimir Youth Association that has its start still in the 1950s, specifically in this format of gathering people together, gathering the youth to discuss topics of spiritual nature, of moral nature, and we are trying to continue that tradition that was started even Nadia, your father participated as Boris Kicenko in these Prince Vladimir youth groups that were started in the 50s and 60s. It took place in different cities, and so we're trying to continue this tradition. We hope to have more of these symposiums, discussions, talks. We hope that maybe during the springtime of next year, and have this as at least as a biannual tradition here, and maybe this will catch on in other places as well. I'm very grateful for everyone who came and who is supporting this evening. We have some information about the Prince Vladimir Youth Associations there and leaflets. Please, I encourage you to take part in this.